The Sega Genesis is both an interesting device and a significant piece of gaming history that seems to embody the quirky and edge characteristics of the early 90s. You had titles like Sonic the Hedgehog, that revved up the speed and intensity of Mario-style platforming. You had games with a tinge of raunchiness like Mortal Kombat and Night Trap, that exemplified the rebellious spirit of the latter part of the 20th century. The Sega Dreamcast was Sega's last best hope as a console maker after their Sega Saturn tanked badly. Released in 1998, it was the first of the sixth-generation systems, the first major console to come with a modem and online play capability, and was far superior to not only everything then on the market, but was in many ways better than the systems that would eclipse it. For as old and depressed as it makes some of us feel when a console we grew up playing hits the 3-decade mark, it's also a cause for celebration. In this case, we're honoring the iconic Sega Genesis with a list of some its lesser-known facts. First of all, I want you to know that Sega Genesis games are still being made. I'm sure a lot of you know this one but don't know all of it. What's old is new again. At least this is what some developers hope to prove. Among these are Pico Interactive, who are releasing a slew of newly created and remastered games, a few of which can be played on the Sega Genesis, in all their 16-bit cartridge. In recent years, some of the people who would have made homebrew games in the past have instead taken to making retro-styled games for newer systems. The result is games like Shovel Knight, made very much to look and sound like an NES game. Even major publishers have taken up the trend, with franchises like Mega Man and Double Dragon getting official modern sequels designed to look like they were created in 1988. As such, there are games like Tanglewood that have been made using actual Genesis development software and being released for the system, even as we are now past 20 years since it was officially discontinued by Sega. The Dreamcast is still very popular with indie game developers, and we've seen a host of games come out in the last couple of years or so. No matter what the market tells you, the Dreamcast never really died at all. They share their hardware stuff with Apple Mac. In an effort to keep costs down and streamline, game systems are sometimes built with what are called off-the-shelf parts, meaning pieces of hardware and equipment that already exist in some capacity are rather being used than everything being built from scratch. And to be honest, this particular practice is what has served the Nintendo team very well over the decades, being one of the few companies that frequently turns a profit on each hardware unit sold from a system's launch because they use a lot of pre-built hardware architecture in their platforms. Sega did this very thing when they constructed the console that first took a major bite out of Nintendo's once seemingly unstoppable empire. The main processor that powered the Genesis was the Motorola 68000. It looked pretty, right? But hey, this same thing was also the brain of the then 5-year-old original Apple Macintosh computer. In addition to giving Sega a lower overhead in building the system, using the Motorola 68000 also made it much easier for developers to figure out how to make games for the system, as many had already been using that chip for years, which is why many former computer game makers like EA were so eager to jump onto the Genesis. It had online features and support. These days, taking video games online is so common as analog sticks and X buttons. In fact, in many cases, video games require an internet connection in order to play them at all. But the early days of the internet, where dial-up was king, and speeds were as slow as molasses. Since the technology was in its infancy, it was understandable that gaming hardware had yet to make much use of it. But as it happens, Sega had in fact toyed with the idea of online support for their Genesis. On a mass mainstream level, online gaming became a thing around the turn of the millennium, especially on consoles. As they often are, Sega was a major trailblazer in this regard, taking the big step of having the Dreamcast be the first console to ever ship with a built-in modem for online play. As early as 1990, Sega launched its Mega Modem, a cart-based online peripheral, in Japan. It never took off though, and never even made it to the US. It offered users access to 17 different games that, for their time, were only available through the service. Later, in 1994, Sega launched the Sega Channel service, which connected the Genesis to the internet through a cable TV provider and let its users access various features like demos, news, tips, and even access to complete, Sega Channel exclusive games like Mega Man. Sega Genesis pioneered the rating system in games. With Nintendo gobbling up much of the kid market, Sega made it a mission to target everyone else. Their primary goal, however, were teenagers. This meant we'd see bloodier and more gritty titles like Mortal Kombat, and even titles like Toe Jam and Earl, which were at least a tinge edgier. It also turned out to be what politicians were looking for as well, and they soon started to go after the video game industry for its increasingly adult content. Inevitably, this led to many coming down on the company for corrupting the youth. As a response to the hearings, Sega decided to be proactive and create its own self-imposed ratings system to help parents make more informed choices as to what games are and are not appropriate for their children. Soon after, the rest of the industry followed Sega's lead and devised a universal rating system that was very similar to Sega's. It had an amazing graphics chip that allowed for almost 3D graphics. For just about every Nintendo move in the 90s, there seems to be a roughly equal and congruent move by Sega. Much like the pseudo-3D graphical abilities that augmented the SNES via Mode 7, Sega had a similar graphics chip. It was known as the SVP, or Sega Virtual Processor, and it allowed for a 3D-like effect by rendering polygons. But alas, like many unconventional gaming gimmicks, this wasn't widely supported. In fact, only a single game utilized its capabilities, and that is Virtual Fighter Racing. The Electronic Arts created their own development kit for the Genesis console. Electronic Arts decided that it didn't need to bother with Sega in the production and release of its own Genesis games, so they went ahead and reverse-engineered Genesis dev kits to just make games entirely on its own. Unlike Accolade, EA wasn't just some obscure upstart and was already an established, respected computer game maker going all the way back to its 1983 breakout hit One-on-One. EA founder Trip Hawkins decided to just skip lengthy, costly legal wrangling and go straight to Sega, demanding Sega to give EA a decent licensing deal, at lest he just go ahead and make Genesis games on his own, which, as we now know, he was well within his legal right to do. Sega essentially had no choice but to agree, and soon, EA was producing Genesis games with Sega's blessing, license. Of course, EA ended up becoming a key component of the Genesis's success, as the system became the primary home for EA's legendary sports games during the 16-bit era. Other consoles had many of the same games, but they all just seemed to look, sound, and play better on the Genesis than other consoles. Ever wonder why EA's Genesis games were a little taller than standard Genesis cartridges and had that little yellow tab? Yep, that was a direct result of the sneaky way it went about developing its games so it served an actual function beyond just being eye-catching. Sega Genesis made official wireless controller. Yes, it seems Sega has helped pioneer another modern staple in gaming, the wireless controller. Along with its original 3-button standard, and the 6-button variant, Sega also stepped up their controller game another notch with a wireless variety. Even though wireless controllers have been prevalent for much of gaming history, for the most part, wireless controllers had been the realm of third-party companies prior to the release of the Xbox 360, the first console to ever launch with wireless controllers. Sega, of course, bowed out of the console game long before wireless controllers became standard for consoles around the mid-aughts. But that isn't to say that it hadn't dipped its toes into them before that. Like most wireless controllers of the era, Sega's wireless Genesis controllers relied on infrared rather than radio waves or Bluetooth, obviously not the latter as it has only just been invented and was far from mass-market ready, meaning that a fairly directly line of sight with their receiver was required. For those that have used them, the consensus on Sega's wireless Genesis controller is largely positive for a wireless controller of the day, but they weren't much of a hit and Sega didn't push them for very long. You just need to plug an infrared peripheral into the controller ports, and you're clear to play games absent bulky and bothersome wires. And it works surprisingly well considering how new the tech was at the time. The Genesis was actually Sega's third console. This means Sega had an amazing stuff way before Genesis. For North American who were not even aware of the Master systems, the common assumption was that the Genesis was Sega's first home console. The fact that Sega of America went with the name Genesis, a name referring to being the first of or the introduction to something, didn't do much to dissuade people from that belief. Imagine going back to the early 90s and informing Genesis owners that not only was the Genesis not Sega's first console, but it was actually its third. Without its stable of iconic franchises to draw from, yet and due to some questionable design choices, the Sega 1000 was quickly forgotten, though it ended up being a necessary first step in Sega's evolution into the company that would soon bring the world the hugely successful Genesis Mega Drive. It had a backward compatibility for the Master Drive systems, while Nintendo had to ditch their planned backward compatibility feature for its upcoming SNES. Sega looked to one-up them by including the feature on Genesis. This would allow Sega's 16-bit system to play games from the Sega Master System, opening it up to a far wider library of games. That said, this did not come out of the box, as you needed to purchase a separate attachment to plop onto the top loader. I said earlier that I will be given 9 facts in this video. But hey, there's a bonus one a lot of fans never knew, and that's one advantage of being here. Sega Genesis had motion controls long ago before the Nintendo Wii's kind of controls. Yeah, believe it or not, motion controls in gaming existed long before the iconic Wii console. It turns out that Sega was dipping their toes in the turbulent full motion control waters as early as 1993. These actually made them one of the best consoles. Can we call it the Sega Genesis VR? Unfortunately, this monstrosity was a nightmare to assemble, and motion controls were usually dicey at best, and nearly non-functional at worst. Novelty aside, flailing your limbs around for minimal, barely responsive control functionality wasn't the most fun way to game. For whatever reason, it seems to be a commonly held belief that the SNES ended up winning the 16-bit console war in North America. The truth is, it is tough to get precise numbers on which console sold how many units during their respective lifetimes, but the general consensus is that the race was ultimately almost too close to call. So, let's just call the war between the Genesis and the SNES to be a draw in the US. However, when you look at the numbers for the rest of the world, there's almost no contest. The Mega Drive fairly handily beat out the SNES in almost every territory. If you're new here, hit the big red subscribe button to stick around the gaming tiger. Thanks for watching.